For 20 years my children told people I was dead, and the strangest part is I stood there and listened to them say it, not once, not twice, but over and over again like it was the truth they had chosen to live with. I remember the first time it happened because it didn't feel real. We were at a wedding, one of those loud, perfect-looking family gatherings where everyone smiles and pretends their life is perfect. I had worn my best sari that day, hoping, just hoping, that maybe this time my children would introduce me with pride. Instead, I stood a few steps behind them, and someone asked my daughter, "Where are your parents?" She smiled and said, "They both passed away years ago." I didn't move, I didn't speak, I just stood there trying to understand what I had just heard. I waited for her to laugh, to correct herself, to say it was a joke, but she didn't. She kept talking like she hadn't just erased me from existence. And the worst part wasn't her words, it was me. I stayed silent, I didn't step forward, I didn't say, "I'm right here." I just smiled like a stranger standing inside someone else's life. That night I went home and sat alone in the dark. No lights, no noise, just silence. And one sentence kept repeating in my mind, "They both passed away years ago." Again and again until it stopped feeling shocking and started feeling normal. And that's when a question came into my mind: if I'm already dead to them, then why am I still living like I matter? That night something inside me changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because for the first time in 20 years I stopped waiting for their love and I started accepting their truth. And what they didn't know was that very soon, I would give them exactly what they had been telling the world all along. I wasn't always invisible in their lives. There was a time when I was everything. After my husband died, the world didn't just become quiet, it became heavy. Every responsibility, every decision, every fear fell onto my shoulders overnight. And there was no one left to share it with. I still remember the day I had to tell my children their father wasn't coming back. My son looked at me and said, "When will Papa come home?" I didn't have an answer, I just held him and stayed silent, because sometimes the truth is too heavy to say out loud. From that day on, I stopped being just their mother. I became everything: mother, father, provider, protector. I worked mornings at a small school and nights stitching clothes just to earn a little more. Some days I barely slept, but I never let them feel that. When they needed new shoes, I found a way. When they needed books, I made sure they had them, even if it meant I had to go without. My son once looked at my plate and asked, "Mom, why aren't you eating?" I smiled and said, "I already ate earlier." That was a lie, but it was a lie I told with love, because I wanted them to grow without ever feeling what I was going through. Birthdays were always special, no matter how difficult things were. I remember one night I stayed awake for hours baking a small cake at home because I couldn't afford to buy one. When my daughter saw it, her eyes lit up. She hugged me tightly and said, "You're the best mom in the world." And I believed her. I held on to those words like they would last forever. I was there for everything, every fever, every exam, every fear they had. When they cried, I held them. When they doubted themselves, I reminded them who they were. I gave them everything I had without ever asking for anything in return. Not money, not gifts, not even recognition, because I believed something very simple: that love, especially a mother's love, never goes unnoticed. But I was wrong. Because while I was busy building their lives, they were slowly building one without me. At first, the distance didn't feel like rejection. It felt like life moving forward. My son got his first job, my daughter built her own world, and I told myself this was what I had worked for: their success, their independence. But slowly something began to change, not suddenly, not loudly, just quietly. Phone calls became shorter. "Mom, I'll call you later." Visits became rare. "Mom, I'm busy this week." And conversations started feeling like a duty instead of love. I remember one evening, I called my son just to hear his voice. He picked up after a few rings and said, "Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can you make it quick?" Make it quick. I paused for a moment, trying to decide what part of my feelings could fit into something quick, so I said, "I just wanted to ask if you had dinner." There was silence, then a tired sigh. "Yes, Mom, I ate." "I'll call you later." He didn't. That later never came. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and slowly I stopped calling as often, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't want to feel like I was disturbing them. My daughter stopped visiting completely. The reasons changed every time. Travel is tiring, I have guests, I'm busy, but the result was always the same. She didn't come. I started noticing something else too. Whenever I was around them, they felt uncomfortable, not openly, but enough for me to feel it. Their conversations changed when I was there, their tone shifted. Their patience became shorter, like I didn't belong in their world anymore. I tried to understand their life, I asked questions, I showed interest. But every answer felt distant. Mom, you won't get it, it's complicated, it's not your kind of thing. And slowly, without anyone saying it directly, I understood something. I was no longer important in their lives. I was optional. And the most painful part, I adjusted, I lowered my expectations, I stopped asking, I stopped calling too much, I started waiting instead, waiting for a call, waiting for a message. Waiting for something, anything that would remind me I still mattered, but the waiting only made one thing clearer with each passing day. They weren't just busy, they were choosing a life where I didn't exist. The moment I truly understood everything didn't come slowly, it came all at once. At another wedding, I almost didn't go that day. Something inside me already felt out of place even before I reached there. But I told myself maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they would see me. I wore my best sari again, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I still believed, somewhere deep inside, that I was their mother. When I reached the venue, I saw them standing with their friends, confident, smiling, perfect. For a moment I felt proud. I thought I raised them like this. So I walked toward them slowly, not to interrupt, just to stand close enough to feel included. That's when someone looked at me and asked a simple question. Oh, who is she? Such a normal question, but the answer changed everything. My son didn't hesitate, he didn't even look at me, he just smiled and said, she's just someone from our hometown. Someone, not mother, not family, just someone. I stood there frozen, not shocked, not angry, just empty, because in that moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. They had already decided who I was in their lives, and it wasn't family. I waited for a second, maybe two, hoping one of them would turn around and say, no, she's our mother. But they didn't. They continued talking, laughing as if I didn't exist at all, so I did what I had been doing for years. I smiled. I nodded and I walked away, but this time something didn't walk away with me. Something stayed there in that moment and broke completely. Later that evening, my daughter came to me casually, like nothing had happened. She said, Mom, you shouldn't come too close when I'm with my friends. I looked at her and asked quietly, why? She avoided my eyes and said, it just affects our image. Our image, that word stayed with me longer than anything else that night, because in that one sentence she didn't just explain her behavior, she justified it, and in that moment I stopped expecting anything from them, not respect. Not love, not even acknowledgement, because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. I wasn't losing them anymore, I had already lost them. That night I didn't cry. For the first time in years I didn't feel pain the way I used to. There were no tears, no questions, no why me, just silence. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was clear. I sat alone in my house, looking around at everything that once meant something to me. The walls, the furniture, the photographs, all of it was still there, but none of it felt like mine anymore. Because the people who gave those things meaning were already gone, not physically, but emotionally, and suddenly everything started making sense. Every missed call, every short conversation, every excuse. Every moment they made me feel like I didn't belong. It wasn't happening slowly. It had already happened, I just refused to see it. For 20 years I had been waiting for a call, waiting for a visit. Waiting for them to remember who I was to them. But they never would, because in their world I didn't exist anymore. I stood up and walked toward the mirror, and for a moment I just looked at myself, not as a mother, not as someone waiting, but as a person who had been forgot, and I asked myself something simple. What are you still holding on to? There was no answer because there was nothing left to hold, no connection, no relationship, no place in their lives, only memories, and even those didn't belong to the present anymore. That's when something inside me shifted, not emotionally. Mentally, completely, I stopped waiting, I stopped hoping, I stopped expecting, and in that moment I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of truth. If they had already removed me from their lives, then I would stop trying to stay in it. If they wanted a life where I didn't exist, I would give it to them. Completely, no calls, no messages, no silent presence, nothing, because I finally understood something I should have understood years ago. You can't force someone to see your value if they have already decided you don't have one. And the moment I accepted that, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not sadness, not anger, but control. For the first time in 20 years, my life wasn't about waiting for them anymore. It was about choosing myself. The decision was made, and for the first time in years I didn't feel confused about what to do next. There was no rush, no panic, just clarity. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was something different about that day. I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't hoping for anything. I simply sat down and started thinking. Not about memories, not about emotions, but about actions. What needed to change, what needed to end, and what needed to begin. I took a notebook and wrote one simple question at the top of the page. What needs to be done? And slowly the answers started coming. The house, the number, the connections, everything that still tied me to a life where I didn't exist. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. There was no reason to. This wasn't a decision I needed approval for. This was something I needed to complete quietly. I started with the simplest change. I stopped calling them completely. Not once, not even by mistake. At first it felt strange. My hand would reach for the phone out of habit, especially in the evenings, but every time I stopped myself and reminded myself they already let go. Now it was my turn. Then I moved to the next step, the house. I walked through each room slowly, not to remember but to observe. Everything was still there, but nothing felt alive anymore. The walls held memories, but those memories didn't belong to the present. I opened old cupboards, went through clothes, documents, photographs. At one point I found an old picture of my son as a child, holding my hand and smiling at the camera. For a moment I stopped. That familiar feeling tried to come back, but this time I didn't let it. I looked at the picture and then quietly placed it back because I understood something clearly now. That moment was real, but it was also over. And holding on to it wouldn't bring it back. A few days later I contacted a property agent. My voice was calm when I said, "I want to sell my house." He asked questions, why now, how soon, was I sure, but I didn't explain anything. I just said, as soon as possible, because I wasn't emotionally attached anymore, not to the house, not to the memories inside it, not to anything that kept me stuck. While the paperwork was being handled, I moved to the next step, my phone number. I went to the service center and filled out the forms. The man at the counter looked at me and asked, "Are you sure you want to deactivate your old number?" For a second I looked at the screen. That number had been part of my life for years. It held every missed call, every unanswered message, every moment I had waited. Then I nodded. Yes. Just like that it was gone. No announcement, no explanation, no warning. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't need anyone to understand. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. And slowly, without noise, without confrontation, I began removing myself from the life I had been holding onto for 20 years, piece by piece, step by step, until there was nothing left tying me to it. The day I left, no one was there to see it. No goodbye, no final conversation. No one asking me to stay, just me standing in a house that no longer felt like home. I walked through each room one last time. Not to remember, but to acknowledge that it was over. The kitchen where I had cooked for years, the corner where my children used to sit and study, the window where I had spent countless evenings waiting for a call that never came. Everything was still, but it didn't hold me anymore. I picked up my suitcase. It was light because I had stopped carrying things that no longer belonged to me. For a brief moment I stood at the door, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the truth of what I was doing. 20 years of waiting, ending in one quiet step. Then I opened the door and walked out. I didn't look back. The journey was long but peaceful. There were no thoughts pulling me back, no doubts, no hesitation, just a strange kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. When I reached the new place, everything was unfamiliar, a small town. Quiet streets, no one who knew me, no one who expected anything from me, and for the first time that felt right. I rented a small house on the edge of the town. It wasn't big, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. That first night I sat alone again, just like I had done so many times before, but this time it felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with waiting. It wasn't filled with hope that something would change. It was just peaceful. The next morning I woke up without checking my phone, without expecting anything, without waiting. I made tea slowly and sat by the window, watching the sunlight fill the room. Simple, quiet, real. Days passed and I started building a new routine. Small things, morning walks, talking to neighbors who didn't know my past, going to the market without feeling out of place, living without trying to fit into someone else's world. And slowly something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about them, not completely, not instantly, but gradually. The memories became quieter, the pain became lighter because I wasn't feeding it anymore. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping anymore. I had finally stepped out of a life where I didn't exist, and into one where I could finally see myself again. It didn't take long for them to notice. At first it was small, a call that didn't connect, a message that stayed unread. They probably thought I was busy, or maybe just ignoring them for once. But as days turned into weeks, confusion started replacing indifference. They tried calling again and again, but every time the same response: the number you are trying to reach is not available, unreachable. For the first time, they couldn't reach me. Eventually, they contacted the neighbors. "Have you seen our mother?" That question alone came too late. The neighbors told them the truth. She moved. She sold the house. Moved, sold the house without telling them. It didn't make sense to them because in their minds I was always there, waiting, available, unchanging. But this time I wasn't. They came back to the house, but it wasn't theirs anymore. New people. New voices, no sign of me anywhere, no belongings, no memories left behind, nothing. And for the first time they felt something unfamiliar. Loss. Not distance, not silence, but complete absence. I can imagine them standing there, confused, maybe even frustrated, asking questions like, why didn't she tell us? But the real question, the one they probably didn't want to ask, was something else. When was the last time they had truly asked about me? Not out of habit, not out of formality, but genuinely. They searched for a while, called relatives, checked old contacts, tried to trace where I had gone, but there was nothing, because I had removed myself completely. No number, no address. No connection left, and for the first time in their lives, they felt what it meant to lose access to someone. Because losing someone slowly feels different. You get used to it, you ignore it, you justify it, but losing someone completely, without warning, without explanation, that's when it hits. That's when it becomes real. And by the time they understood that, there was nothing left to hold on to. I didn't hear from them directly, no calls, no messages, no sudden apology, just silence. The same silence I had lived with for years, but this time it was different because I wasn't the one waiting anymore. Months passed. And slowly I started hearing things, not from them but from people who still knew them. Someone mentioned they had come back to the house again. Another said they were asking questions, trying to find out where I had gone. Searching. Really searching, but by then it didn't matter anymore. Because whatever they were feeling, whatever realization was finally reaching them, it had come too late. Regret doesn't come when things start breaking, it comes when everything is already gone. Maybe they sat together at some point, talking about it, trying to understand what had happened. Maybe they remembered small things. The way I used to call just to ask if they had eaten. The way I waited without ever complaining. The way I stayed even when I wasn't wanted. And maybe, just maybe, they finally saw it, not as children but as people. What they had done, what they had ignored, what they had slowly destroyed. But realization doesn't change the past, and it doesn't bring people back, because the truth is they didn't lose me the day I disappeared. They lost me slowly, over time, over missed calls, over short conversations. Over every moment they chose not to care. My disappearance wasn't sudden, it was the final step of something that had already happened. And by the time they understood that, I was already gone in every way that mattered. People think revenge is loud, they imagine arguments, shouting, big dramatic endings where everything is said, but real life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing. No explanation, no confrontation, no final words, just walking away, not because you want to hurt someone but because you finally understand something they never did. I didn't disappear to punish them. I didn't do it to make them suffer. I did it because I realized something very simple. I was living in a place where I wasn't valued, wasn't respected, wasn't even seen. And staying there was hurting me more than leaving ever could. For 20 years I waited for them to see me, to choose me, to remember who I was to them. But the truth is, you can't force someone to value you if they've already decided you don't matter. And the moment you stop trying, you start seeing everything clearly. I didn't lose my children. I lost the version of them that only existed in my expectations. And once I accepted that, everything became easier, because I wasn't holding on to something that no longer existed. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: if someone can live without you, you can learn to live without them too. Not out of anger, not out of ego, but out of self-respect, because your life doesn't end when someone decides you don't matter. Sometimes that's where it finally begins. Direct hit CTA engagement boost. If you felt this story, comment below. I choose myself. And if this reminded you of someone, share it with them, because sometimes the hardest decision is the one that saves you.